is going to, Professor Rose LUCKIN is going to deliver a speech titled Education in the Digital Age, What's the Role of AI? And I would like to present a short biography info of Professor Dr. Rose LUCKIN. Rose LUCKIN is Professor of Learner-Centered Design at the UCL Knowledge Lab in London. Her research involves the design and evaluation of educational technology using theories from the learning sciences and techniques from artificial intelligence, AI. She has a particular interest in using AI to open up the black box of learning to show teachers and students the detail of their progress intellectually, emotionally, and socially. Rose is also the director of Educate, a London hub for educational technology startups, researchers, and educators to work together on the development of evidence-informed educational technology. Rose was named on the Sheldon List 2017 as one of the 20 most influential people in education. She's a UFI charity trustee, a governor and trustee of St. Paul's School in London, and a governor of the Self-Managed Learning College in Brighton. She has taught in the state secondary, further education, and higher sectors, and she was previously Pro-Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning at the University of Sussex. So, welcome back again to the keynote session, Rose LUCKIN. The microphone and the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I only wish I could be there in person. It would be so lovely to be in Turkey. I visited before and always had a lovely time. Now, let me just see. I'm hoping that you can see that slide that should say Education in the Digital Age, What is the Role of AI? So please shout if you can't. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today, and in particular to talk to you about this subject, because so much has happened in the last 18 months with the COVID pandemic that I think has had a big impact on the way that we think about digital technologies in education. And I think that also involves thinking about artificial intelligence. So let's get started. Do you remember Christmas 2019? Christmas 2019, people like myself who were working in educational technology and e-learning and artificial intelligence were mainly concerned with the fourth industrial revolution. We were thinking about how is this going to impact on the workplace? How is it going to impact, therefore, on the way that we need to educate people, on training people? What kinds of skills, abilities, knowledge, expertise do we need to develop? And can we use artificial intelligence in education to help us to develop that knowledge, those skills, and that expertise? And that was the main concern for people like myself. We were thinking about the OECD Learning Compass 2030 project and the way that they were trying to redesign the curriculum, thinking about well-being, interesting times, lots of conversations about the future of work. And then we came to March 2020 and everything was disrupted by this tiny little virus that we've become all too familiar with. And I think it's a really important point in time to stand back and say, well, what can we learn from this challenge? What should we be taking away from this that can improve the way that we use technology, the way that we design technology, and particularly artificial intelligence? Well, certainly we can learn that people were able to continue learning at home, out in the street, in groups, wherever they could get together. But we also learned that actually it was quite stressful for some people, made some people very anxious, and we need to find out more. So from our perspective, the first thing that we wanted to do after we realized that this pandemic and the disruption it was causing to education was not going to go away quickly, we started collecting data and research from teachers, students, parents, governors, policymakers, school leaders, to try and find out more about their experience so that we could understand better how to advise people about how the future might be looking, how we needed to use technology, what kinds of technology we needed to use, perhaps something about the types of skills, knowledge, expertise that we needed to develop in young people and in teachers, perhaps in parents too. And we conducted this data gathering task from the beginning of April 2020 until the end of 2020. And we looked at all of the data that we'd collected from that start in April to the end of October when we conducted this analysis. And we found that actually one of the key things that had been problematic was that we very rarely pay much attention to the whole education ecosystem when we're thinking about policy making, when we're thinking about developing curricula, when we're thinking about deciding how to teach, who to teach, what to teach, where to teach. We often focus on one part of that ecosystem. And certainly when the pandemic caused chaos in many education systems and schools had to close, that place, that school building that had become a big part of what education was for many young people, or university or training college, was taken away from the system, and the ecosystem itself wasn't strong enough to really work with that impoverished ecosystem. It didn't have the resilience initially. However, it has to be said that in the vast majority of places, teachers were amazing, as were parents and students, and very quickly they got up and running, but perhaps not in optimal ways. One of the key things that we found was that when there were very effective communication channels between different parts of the ecosystem, so for example, between parents and schools, then actually people's views about the positive nature of the experience were much better. So parents who felt that they were well communicated to by their school were 10 times more likely to believe that that school was successful in the way that it was handling the pandemic than parents who had not felt they'd been well communicated to. And certainly in the UK, we found that there was poor communication between government and school leaders, and that certainly compromised the way that those school leaders were able to lead and to help teachers, parents, children to cope with all the disruptions. But in general, building these connections and making sure communication between the different parts of the education system, of the education ecosystem, I should say, so that schools, parents, employers, students, school leaders, governors, policymakers, trying to make sure that we look at the whole ecosystem is extremely important. And it's also important, not just because we need to create those connections and those communication channels, but also because we need to understand that the ecosystem is very diverse and the needs of that ecosystem are extremely diverse. Not all people in the education ecosystem experienced and dealt with COVID-19 disruption in the same way. And actually, by looking at those differences in the way that people need to be supported, in the way that different people recognize different opportunities and have different concerns, we can start to understand how better to differentiate the sort of support that we provide, particularly when it comes to helping people understand about using educational technology. Now, I found this very interesting that in 2021, when we finished the analysis of that data that was collected in 2020, I found myself reminded of a report that we had written in 2012. Now, this was a report called Decoding Learning, and it was work that was done with an innovation charity in the United Kingdom called Nesta. And what we were looking at was the evidence about the ways in which technology was good or not at supporting the teaching and learning process. And one of the conclusions that we came to from that report, and an excerpt is there on the screen, was that industry researchers and teachers needed to work more closely together to test ideas and evaluate potential innovations before they're taken to market. And it was this notion of the ecosystem that was very much at the forefront of our mind when we were looking into this. And I think that's the message that came back very strongly for the work that we did looking at COVID. But what's all this got to do with artificial intelligence? And how can we use artificial intelligence to better create those communications and those connections? And how can we use AI to differentiate the support that we give to different groups of individuals, communities, sub-communities within that overall education ecosystem? Firstly, let's just be clear about what I'm talking about when I'm talking about artificial intelligence. I'm very much talking about technology that's capable of acting and behaving in ways that require intelligence when done by humans. So it's about technology behaving in ways that we would see as being intelligent if those actions, if that behavior was being done by a human. And I'm sure all of you, wherever you are likely to be using some kind of artificial intelligence. Maybe you used speech to text. I know I dictate notes on my phone a lot of the time. Maybe you have a smart home device. Maybe you use an intelligent speaker or a voice-activated personal assistant, as they're often referred to, Alexa or Siri, or whatever's your particular favorite instantiation of that. Maybe you do shopping online, that often uses AI, or maybe like me, you have a fitness device and you like to track your exercise, number of steps you're taking, how far you're running, what your heart rate is. And many of these systems also use artificial intelligence. Or perhaps in the times when we are allowed to travel, we use some kind of an AI application to help us plan and travel across the country, across the world. Now, the reason, and it's important to understand this reason, that artificial intelligence is so popular, prevalent, ubiquitous, we might say, at the moment, is really because in the last few years, we've experienced a perfect storm. And that perfect storm has three key ingredients. Firstly, there's data. We have access to huge amounts of data now that certainly when I was training in artificial intelligence, I didn't even dream about. We also have very sophisticated algorithms, deep learning algorithms that can help us to process all that data and learn from that data. And thirdly, we have enough affordable computing power and memory to enable us to process that data with those very smart algorithms. And this is the first time, the last few years that is the first time that we've had those three innovations, developments, meeting, creating this perfect storm that means that we can, at scale, process data using AI and use it to make changes in the world. Now, I think it's useful to consider how this impacts on education in three different ways. Firstly, we can think about how artificially intelligent technologies can help us in teaching and learning. And as you heard in my introduction, I taught in schools and in further education before I started teaching in universities. So we've had a lot of experience of teaching. And even now, I'm definitely still learning about how to teach. But I know that we can use artificial intelligence very usefully and to great benefit within education. So we'll have a look at some of the ways that we can do that. And then there's another category of ways in which the current situation impacts on education. And that is the fact that it's brought us the need to help people understand enough about artificial intelligence to be able to use it safely and to benefit from using it. And then thirdly, and probably the most difficult one of these types of ways that artificial intelligence is impacting on education, is the way that AI is changing the world and therefore changing the kinds of skills, knowledge, expertise that our students need to develop while they're at school, at college, at university, if they're going to be successful and happy in their future lives, able to work, able to progress. And that's what all of us as educators want, of course. So firstly, let's have a look at this first category of ways in which some of the sorts of AI that are available now can be used to help us with some of the educational challenges we face, not least those arising from the need to connect and to meet the needs of diverse populations, the things that we've learned we really need to do even more than ever in the wake of the current pandemic. And so let's think first of all about how AI can help us to adapt to the individual needs of learners, groups of learners, communities of learners, so that each of them receives the kind of education that they need as individuals. And certainly AI is very good at helping with this adaptation. So if you look on the screen, you can see an example of a software application called N Skills, EN Skills, produced by a company called Alelo, based in the United States. This company was formed as a spin-off from a university, and they develop artificially intelligent systems that teach and train, particularly with respect to language learning. And so in this example, the student opens up their laptop, opens the browser, and can have a conversation with the character on the screen. They talk to the character on the screen, and the character on the screen responds and helps the student to understand whether they are using their language skills effectively, whether they're pronouncing words properly. The conversation becomes more advanced as the student is ready. And every student's experience is different because the AI learns from all of the data it has about students who are learning language. The AI learns so that it is able to adapt to meet the needs of each individual student. And this adaptivity, this feature of artificial intelligence to allow adaptive educational support, is something that we see in many of the AI applications available today. This is another product, a maths product produced by a company called Carnegie Learning, another university spin-off, this time from Carnegie Mellon University, and this is about maths. And then we have companies like Century, who are a UK-based company, whose product again is adaptive, but across the whole curriculum, not specific to one subject area, but across the curriculum. And that means that you can look at how a student is performing in geography, say, English, history, and maths, and look for common features or differences between the way that they're performing, learning, behaving across the different areas of the curriculum. Now, the second way in which adaptation as a feature, as a characteristic of artificial intelligence systems can be found are in systems that are recommender systems. So these are systems that don't actually tutor, rather they find the best educational resources to meet your needs or your students' needs. So this is an example of a company called Filtered, who provide training applications, and you can have a conversation at the interface of this software. Now, it's not a spoken conversation in the way that it was with the first example from Enlelo. This is a conversation where you have a dialogue you type into the screen. And as you type into the screen and have a dialogue with the software, it learns about you and goes away and finds the most useful resources to help you learn about what you want to learn. Maybe it's about presentation skills, or maybe it's about solving quadratic equations. Whatever it is, the system will come back and recommend resources for you as an individual, adapting to what the system believes you need. Now, AI is not just useful at adapting for particular subject areas in the curriculum or for a whole curriculum like Century Tech. You can always also use AI in applications like this one from My Cognition, which is about cognitive fitness. This piece of software conducts a diagnostic review of an individual when they first use the software. And this review looks at that individual's ability to pay attention, to remember things, both short-term and long-term, and speed of reaction. And all of these features combine for this cognitive fitness measure. And once the system has done its evaluation and diagnosed your needs, it then sets you off on a game called Aquasnap, and it adjusts the game to help develop the elements of your cognitive fitness that you as an individual most need to develop. Now, another thing that's really useful in artificial intelligence is, in addition to being able to adapt so that it can meet the needs of a diverse population, it can work with lots of different sources of data about an individual, a student, say, to ensure that the way that it adapts is influenced by the widest range of data possible in order to try and make sure that that adaptation is optimal to that student. And so this is an interesting example. This is from the University of Southern California, as you can see, and it's a system called SimSensei. Now, SimSensei is a counselor. You can see the character sitting there in the purple chair. And this is an on-screen character, just like in the first example from Alelo. And the on-screen character has a dialogue with a student in order to provide support for that student. Now, whilst having the dialogue, the SimSensei software collects data from that student's facial expressions, from their voice, its pitch, its tone, its speed, whether there are pauses, long silences. And the SimSensei software analyzes this data in real time and feeds it in to the way that SimSensei adapts the counseling support that's provided for that student. So that means that the adaptation is based on the data that the system already holds about that particular student from previous interactions or perhaps from university progress reports. In addition, it's also adapting on the basis of data that it collects moment to moment as the SimSensei avatar counselor is interacting with that student. Excuse me, I thought I was going to cough then. Sorry, just turn the microphone off there for that cough. And just in case you were thinking that AI is only for adults or school-age learners, here's a really interesting example. The different sort of adaptation where the software is adapting to the needs of an individual, a very young infant, without that infant even being aware that the technology is there. And so you can see on the screen a little cloud-shaped object with a sun coming out of it. That's a sensor that sits in the room where a very young infant is playing, is interacting with family members, visitors, whoever. And that sensor tracks the sounds, the conversations, the interactions that go on between that young infant and the various different people with whom that infant interacts. It analyzes these audio feeds and produces for parents, in the form of a software application on their mobile phone, personalized advice about how parents can supports that child, that infant, in their language and cognitive development. So a very different kind of example of the way that AI can be used. And finally, in this example, so that's moved on too quickly. Ooh. Here's an example where, again, you might not know there's any artificial intelligence in this system. And I think it's an important example because we need to appreciate that AI isn't always obvious. And we also need to appreciate that the way in which AI can help us isn't always obvious either. And so here we have an example of a company called Third Space Learning. This company provides human tutors for human students on a one-to-one basis. So we have a tutor in one country who provides tutoring for a learner in another country. And the tutor and the learner interact via a shared whiteboard and audio interactions. There's no video. And the idea is to try and make it affordable for students who really need that one-to-one tuition to be able to have that tuition by bringing down the cost of that one-to-one tuition. And one of the most expensive parts of a system like this are the people who review and evaluate the quality of the interactions between tutors and students. Because obviously, if this is going to work, you need to make sure your tutors are the best tutors they can be. And that means you need to be constantly evaluating them and supporting them and helping them to improve. And so there are a lot of people who have to watch the sessions that take place between tutors and students in order to ensure quality. Apologies about the coughing. I think it's a dry office. And so how can we use AI to help with that process? So this is not about replacing people doing the tutoring with any type of AI. It's about supporting the people who are doing the evaluating with some AI to help them evaluate how well the tutoring sessions are going. And to ensure that there is good quality in those tutoring interactions so that all students have the best chance of learning. And so we've been helping this company to develop some AI to assist in that evaluation process so that in the end, they won't need so many people to evaluate the sessions, which will free up more people to be tutors and keep the costs down so that it can be afforded by less well-off people, not just wealthy people. But actually, the AI that we have available to us today is only really scratching the surface of what it's possible to do with artificial intelligence. If we really want to unlock the amazing richness of our human intelligence, there's much more we can do in the future. And at this point, it's really crucial to understand how much more intelligent humans are than AI. So we have this little baby here, and when you look at a young baby and think about all the amazing ways that that infant is going to develop in the next few years, and how incredibly versatile that intelligence will be, you start to realize how incredibly difficult it is to build AI systems that can be anything like as impressive. We've done well with the AI systems that we've built, but they're nowhere near as intelligent as we are. Not across the board. If I say to any of you who are listening today, where have you been this morning or this afternoon? What do you know about AI? How well do you understand the COVID-19 pandemic? How are you feeling right now? You'll be able to answer those questions. Even if you don't know much about AI and you don't feel you understand the pandemic, you'll be able to answer those questions because you are able to reflect on your own knowledge and your own understanding in a way that AI simply can't. And this difference between artificial and human intelligence is really important because we need to make sure that the way that we design and use our artificial intelligence complements our human intelligence. And equally, we need to make sure that the way that we educate humans complements what the AI is good at. We don't want either to repeat what the other is better at. And so when I look at human intelligence, I think about it as a very complex, interwoven set of capabilities, if you like, not separate intelligences, but something that's knitted together to create the very rich, versatile intelligence that is human intelligence. So first of all, we have the interdisciplinary academic intelligence, which is the kind of intelligence that's very much part of the usual school curriculum. We then have meta-knowing intelligence, which is really about understanding what knowledge is, what it means to know something, understanding how you make decisions about whether the evidence you're being given is sufficiently strong that you should believe what that evidence is telling you, or whether you shouldn't. Then we have social intelligence. Now, social intelligence is something that as humans, we're very good at, and it's often how we learn. And then we have a set of meta-intelligences, a bit like the meta-knowing. These are all about being able to reflect on our own intelligence. So with meta-knowing, that's about being able to reflect on the nature of knowledge. With metacognitive intelligence, it's about being able to reflect on our own cognition, on our own thinking, to be able to plan, to be able to regulate our thinking, and to be able to monitor what's going on. So for example, if I'm learning something and I have good metacognitive intelligence, I will notice when I'm losing focus, when my attention is being distracted. That's my monitoring coming into play. And then I'll know how to bring my focus back to pay attention on what it is I need to be learning. Metasubjective intelligence, which is about more than emotional intelligence. It's about our own understanding about the extent to which we are developing that emotional intelligence, and also the extent to which the people with whom we're interacting are developing their emotional intelligence or not. And obviously that's very important for complementing our social intelligence if we're going to take part successfully in collaborative problem solving, for example. Then we have meta-contextual intelligence, which I think we often overlook when we think about human intelligence. And that's our ability as humans to move through the world relatively seamlessly. We are able to interact with different people at different times, in different places, generally without too much upset. In the times when it's possible to travel across the world, I can generally get myself to the airport, even if I haven't been there before. I work out how to get through the airport, I get on a plane, I work out how that particular plane works. I don't mean to fly it, I mean as a passenger. I arrive in another airport, get my way out of it, find my way to the hotel, manage to get food and drink. Sometimes there's a bit of a language barrier, sometimes it takes 1 or 2 attempts to achieve something, but it's very unusual that we become incapable of getting about. And that's because we're very good at interpreting what's happening around us, even if we've never experienced it before. Very, very, very difficult to build AI systems to do anything like that. And finally, we have this notion of perceived self-efficacy, which is about bringing all the intelligence together. We're able to plan to set goals for ourselves, to work out how likely we are to achieve those goals, to understand what we need to do in order to achieve those goals, maybe stuff that we need to learn, maybe people that we need to learn from, how we pull together all the resources we need in order to be able to be successful, because we really do understand ourselves, as well as different areas of the curriculum and different skills. And so this is very, very complicated, and way more complicated than anything artificial intelligence can do at the moment. So we have AI systems that can do quite well with that academic intelligence, and even have some good ability to judge the quality of evidence and to know whether to judge something to be true or not. But they're not really able to be aware of their own knowledge. Social intelligence, they can appear to be social intelligent, but they're not really socially intelligent. They have no chance with any of those other types of human intelligence that we're so good at. And so we really need to value our ability to reflect on ourselves, to understand ourselves as humans, because that's something that the AI can't do for itself. AI can't understand itself in the way that we can learn to understand ourselves, to regulate, to monitor. We're not necessarily very good at these self-regulatory behaviors, at these self-reflective behaviors, at these meta-intelligences when we're born, when we're young, but we can learn to be very good at them. And so this puts us in an interesting position when it comes to the potential that AI brings to us. Because although AI is not good at understanding itself, AI is very good at taking large amounts of data, using very intelligent algorithms to process that data. And if that data is about us and about our learning, the AI can help us to understand more about ourselves. So remember, we have this perfect storm, and data is a very important part of that perfect storm. And there's huge amounts of data that we can collect about us as we move through the world, from things that we wear, from observations, from ways we interact with our technology. And all of this data can be used to help us understand how well we're learning, how well we're developing our personal intelligence. So take this example here. This is a group of students collaborating, and they're trying to build an interactive toy. This is just one very specific example of the ways in which in the future we may be able to build AI systems that can really continually help us to understand how well we're doing, and help us to really develop those meta-intelligences that the AI is not capable of developing. So here we have these students and lots of data being collected about them. There's markers on their hands so that we can track where their hands go. There's eye tracking so we can watch where their eyes go. They can give us information about how they're performing. They're being recorded, audio, video, masses of data being collected. So we have that first of the three ingredients of that perfect storm. Then we need the algorithms. Now we need algorithms to process that data that are designed in a way that uses what we've learned about human learning in the past decade. Because in the same time that artificial intelligence has grown phenomenally and has become much more intelligent, mainly due to deep learning algorithms, in the same time frame, we as researchers have understood a lot more about how humans learn. So if we combine that together, we can really start to understand ourselves. So on this screen, you can see some examples of research that has been done. And in particular, at the top, there's some research there about synchrony. And this research from psychology suggests that actually one of the ingredients that helps us to understand whether a group of students like this is or is not developing good collaborative problem-solving abilities is the extent to which their actions are synchronous. It's not going to tell us everything about collaborative problem-solving. It's going to tell us just a little tiny bit. And there are some other examples there as well. So if we take this very specific example, which we did, and collected lots of data, And we analysed, using AI algorithms, the data that we collected from the students, building algorithms informed by the examples here of what we can learn from mainly psychology studies about human learning to help us design the algorithms to process that data. We found that actually this can be extremely helpful. So on this chart, you can see high CPS, low CPS, high CPS. Now those labels represent the evaluation done by a human expert who wasn't involved in the research, as she watched videos of groups of students like those in the picture collaborating to try and solve problems. And every 5 seconds, she decided whether they were collaborating and problem solving effectively or not. And then the groups were categorized as to whether in a particular moment in time they were high CPS, in other words, effective at collaborative problem solving, or low. Now the lines running horizontally across the screen are the tracks of eye movements and hand movements. And you can see that each line represents one student. And in the 2 high CPS labeled groups, those lines are close together, showing a great deal of synchrony. Whereas in the low CPS, there's a big gap. And this is just one tiny example of the way in which AI can help us to analyze the sorts of data that we can collect very easily. And when that AI is designed in a way that takes into account the things that we've learned about human learning, such as the correlation between synchrony of hand movement and eye gaze and effectiveness of collaborative problem solving, then we can start to pull together lots and lots and lots of different signifiers like that and start to understand how well or poorly a group of students is performing when it comes to collaborative problem solving. And that means that we can flag up to students when they might need to change their behaviour, and we can also flag up to teachers when teachers may need to intervene. And if we put all this together, if you can imagine thousands of little signifiers, just like the one about synchrony, pulled together, we have masses of data, we have intelligent algorithms that process that data, that look for these signifiers. That data comes from lots of different sources that picks up on all the different modalities that humans use to communicate. And we combine with that the learning science in order to design the algorithms. And then we add to that the human intelligence of teachers, learners, parents, employers to interpret what the AI is producing in its analysis and to interpret it in a way that means that learners can benefit. Then we have an intelligence infrastructure, a bit like electricity powers lots of things in people's homes, in schools. This intelligence infrastructure, this combination of that data, smart algorithms, processing power, and human intelligence to interpret what the AI is saying becomes this intelligent infrastructure that can power all of the learning interactions that we have, no matter what kind of technology we're using. And this is the real potential future of the human and the artificial intelligence working together. Now, finally, in the last few minutes, I do want to say a little bit about educating people about AI and changing education systems, because it builds on what I've just been saying, and it's very complementary, because these aren't mutually exclusive categories of implication. Each of these sorts of implication of AI for education interacts with the other. So when it comes to educating people about AI, I honestly believe that it's certainly true that we want some people in a population to understand the real technical details of AI so that they can build the future AI systems that we need. We certainly need people to understand in depth the ethical implications that AI brings. But the thing we need everybody to understand are the basics of artificial intelligence, so that they will be able to use the AI effectively and safely. Also, they'll be able to live and work with AI successfully, effectively, happily. And we also need to think very carefully about this when it comes to ethics. We set up the Institute for Ethical AI in Education in 2018 because we were so concerned that in education, people weren't paying enough attention to the ethical implications. Because regulation is excellent, but it will never be enough. The AI will always be ahead of the regulation. So we need people to understand enough that they can be wary when they should be wary and not wary when they don't need to be wary. And so as a part of this helping people to understand more about AI, we've developed a 7-step AI readiness program that we use for training and indeed for helping educational organizations, schools, colleges, universities get themselves ready to make sensible choices about where to bring AI into their organization. We take people through the 7 steps more than once if necessary to help them really understand how AI would work with the challenges they face. It's a bit like helping people get inside a machine learning algorithm, if you see what I mean, and understand that it needs data and it processes data, and think about how it processes data and the kinds of things that you can learn from that processing. The idea is to help people make much, much better decisions about where AI can best meet their needs. And that final 3rd category is about the biggest challenge of all, and that is how to prepare people to really live and thrive in and beyond the 4th Industrial Revolution. And I think currently the situation we face is a little bit like this. It's a bit like driving along a very, very foggy road in a car you've never driven before, but you know you need to get to a particular location. And there are many reports produced that try to predict exactly what skills will be needed in order for people to get from A to B. But actually predicting those things is not necessarily as useful, particularly if that predicting is about what kinds of job will exist, what kinds of job won't exist. Because actually that's a little bit trying to produce a map for a future that we can't really chart. And the map could be very wrong. Whereas actually when I'm in that situation of an unfamiliar car, very foggy road, I'm trying to move progressively forward, what I really need is to know that I've got good eyesight, I can hear well, I'm a qualified driver, I haven't been drinking, haven't been taking drugs that might impact on my ability to drive, not listening to the radio, I can hear what's going on, the car's reliable, it's got good brakes, got headlights that work, steering stable, I've got enough petrol. Those are the things that actually matter. And so really what we need to be thinking about when it comes to thinking about education is the equivalent of that reliable car, reliable driver for humans, rather than trying to predict the road that we'll need to pass along. And so it is about understanding human intelligence. It is about this business of being able to be meta-intelligent, to be able to understand our own learning, understand our own knowledge and expertise, to know what it's reasonable for us to expect to achieve and what we're unlikely to be able to achieve, to understand who might help us, how we get that help. These are the things that are really important because people will need to be learning throughout their lives. And so we need to think back to the beginning and think about ecosystems, think about the connections between this business of using AI in education, helping people understand AI, and thinking about how we need to change the way that we educate and train people because the